She was supposed to win. That's what made it unbearable. Cleopatra had spent years constructing an alliance that should have been unbreakable. She had chosen Mark Antony not out of desperation but out of calculation. Rome's civil war was tearing the Republic apart, and she had positioned Egypt on what appeared to be the winning side. Antony controlled the eastern provinces. He commanded veteran legions. He had the loyalty of client kings from Syria to Thrace. And he had Egypt's treasury behind him. On the other side stood Octavian. Younger, less experienced in battle, surrounded by advisors who whispered caution. The choice seemed obvious. Cleopatra committed everything to Antony because the logic was sound. She brought her fleet, her gold, her kingdom's entire military capacity to a confrontation that would decide the future of the Mediterranean world. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly certainty could dissolve into confusion, and confusion into irreversible loss. The campaign began in the spring of 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces on the western coast of Greece, near a place called Actium. The location was strategic. It controlled the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, a sheltered bay where their combined fleet could anchor safely. Antony had roughly 500 warships. Cleopatra brought 60 Egyptian vessels, smaller but faster, equipped with experienced crews who had sailed the Red Sea and understood wind patterns better than most Roman sailors. The plan was to blockade Octavian's supply lines, starve his army, and force a land battle where Antony's veteran infantry would crush the younger general's forces. It was a waiting game. Antony had won waiting games before. But Octavian's admiral, a man named Marcus Agrippa, understood something Antony did not. Agrippa knew that large fleets anchored in narrow bays become trapped, not protected. Through the summer, Agrippa's smaller squadrons raided supply depots along the coast. They burned grain stores. They intercepted reinforcements. They seized islands that Antony had assumed were secure. Slowly, without a single major battle, Antony's position eroded. His soldiers began to fall ill. Malaria spread through the camps. Desertions increased. By late summer, Antony faced a choice he had not planned for. He could abandon the fleet, march his army overland, and hope to reach Egypt before Octavian's forces intercepted him. Or he could force a naval engagement, break through Octavian's blockade, and escape to Egypt with his ships and treasury intact. Cleopatra argued for the second option. She believed the fleet could break through. She believed her Egyptian ships, lighter and faster, could outmaneuver Octavian's heavier warships. She believed that once they reached open water, they could regroup, resupply, and continue the war. Antony, exhausted and sick, agreed. The battle began on the 2nd of September. Antony's fleet moved out of the Gulf in the early afternoon, hoping to catch favorable winds. Octavian's ships, commanded by Agrippa, formed a defensive line across the entrance. The two fleets maneuvered carefully, neither willing to commit fully. For hours, the engagement remained tentative. Ships circled, rammed, grappled, disengaged. Neither side gained a decisive advantage. Then, in the late afternoon, Cleopatra made a decision. She saw an opening in the enemy line. She ordered her 60 ships to raise their sails and run. Not retreat. Run for open water. Her intention was likely to preserve the treasury and regroup. But from Antony's ships it looked like abandonment. Panic spread. Antony, watching from his flagship, faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could stay with his fleet and fight, or he could follow Cleopatra. He followed. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and sailed after the Egyptian squadron, leaving 300 warships behind without a commander. What happened next was not a battle. It was a collapse. Antony's remaining captains, seeing their leader flee, lost cohesion. Some tried to follow. Some tried to fight. Most simply surrendered. Octavian's forces captured or burned the majority of the fleet without significant resistance. On land, Antony's legions, hearing the news, began to disintegrate. Officers defected. Soldiers deserted. Within days, the entire army surrendered to Octavian without a fight. Cleopatra and Antony reached Egypt with a fraction of their original force. They had lost the fleet, the army, the treasury reserves they had left behind, and any chance of continuing the war. They still had Egypt itself, but Egypt without allies, without a navy, without the resources to resist Rome's inevitable invasion, was not a kingdom. It was a waiting room. Octavian did not hurry. He spent the winter consolidating his position. He had won the war, but he needed to ensure that no one in Rome would challenge his authority. He redistributed land to his soldiers. He secured the loyalty of the Senate. He prepared a propaganda campaign that would frame the conflict not as a Roman civil war but as a defense of Rome against foreign seduction. Cleopatra became, in Octavian's narrative, the villain, the foreign queen who had corrupted a Roman general, the temptress who had stolen Antony's judgment, the threat to Roman virtue. It was effective because it allowed Romans to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth that their republic had been tearing itself apart for decades. And that Actium was simply the final, exhausted conclusion of a generation of civil war. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian was ready. He invaded Egypt. Cleopatra tried to negotiate. She sent envoys offering terms. She proposed recognizing Octavian's authority in exchange for her children's safety. She offered treasure. She offered strategic concessions. Octavian's responses were deliberately vague. He neither accepted nor rejected her proposals. He wanted her unsure, anxious, unable to plan coherently. Antony, meanwhile, attempted one final defense. He gathered what remained of his forces and marched out to meet Octavian's legions outside Alexandria. The engagement lasted less than a day. His cavalry defected immediately. His infantry, seeing the hopelessness of their position, laid down their arms. Antony returned to the city alone. The next part is contested. Ancient sources disagree on the sequence of events, the motivations, and even the specific actions. What seems clear is that Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum, a fortified tomb she had been constructing for years. She sent a message to Antony, possibly saying she was dead, possibly saying she was besieged, possibly saying nothing of the sort. Antony, receiving news that Cleopatra was gone, asked his servant to kill him. The servant refused and killed himself instead. Antony then took his own sword and stabbed himself in the stomach. It was not immediately fatal. Soldiers found him and carried him to Cleopatra's mausoleum. She refused to open the doors, afraid Octavian's men would force their way in. Instead, ropes were lowered from an upper window. Antony was hauled up, bleeding, semi-conscious, to die in Cleopatra's arms. He lived long enough to speak, though what he said is not reliably recorded. Then he was gone. Cleopatra was now alone. Octavian entered Alexandria and placed the mausoleum under guard. He sent messengers assuring her of his respect and his intention to treat her honorably. He wanted her alive. He wanted her to walk in his triumph in Rome. the ultimate proof of his victory over the East. Cleopatra understood this. She had seen triumphs before. She knew what it meant to be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, an object of mockery and entertainment. She began to plan her death. Octavian, aware of the risk, increased the guard. He sent officials to monitor her constantly. He threatened her children, implying that their safety depended on her cooperation. Cleopatra pretended to acquiesce. She requested time to perform rituals for Antony's burial. She asked for specific foods, specific privacy. Octavian, confident that she was being watched closely enough, granted the requests. Her presence in his triumph. She died on her own terms, at a time she chose, in a manner she controlled. It was the last decision she had left. Octavian, furious, allowed the suicide to stand. He killed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, eliminating any rival claim to power. He spared her other children, raising them in Rome under his supervision. He annexed Egypt as a personal province, not a territory of Rome but his own possession. The richest land in the Mediterranean now feeding his ambitions. And he returned to Rome to celebrate a triple triumph, displaying models of Cleopatra's death in the procession since he could not display the woman herself. What lingers is not the battle or the betrayal or the suicide. It's the arithmetic. Cleopatra had made a reasonable choice. Antony was the stronger candidate. He had the resources, the experience, the territorial control. Octavian was unproven. The logic was sound. But logic depends on variables that cannot always be measured. Leadership collapses. Disease spreads. Desertion accelerates. Wind shifts at the wrong moment. Cleopatra lost everything because she committed everything to a strategy that should have worked. And in doing so, she demonstrated something deeply uncomfortable about power, about history, about the way decisive moments unfold. Certainty is not the same as security. Having good reasons for a choice does not guarantee the choice will succeed. And sometimes the people who lose are not the ones who made foolish decisions, but the ones who made rational decisions that collided with forces beyond their comprehension or control. Later generations simplified her. She became the seductress, the exotic queen, the woman who destroyed empires with beauty. Roman historians framed her as a cautionary tale about foreign influence and female ambition. Renaissance painters depicted her death as erotic tragedy. Pale skin and serpents and luxurious drapery. Modern films emphasize romance, passion, doomed love. What gets lost is the coldness of her calculation, the precision of her political maneuvering, and the absolute finality of her failure. She was not destroyed by love or seduction or poor judgment. She was destroyed by a strategy that failed, by an alliance that collapsed, by a naval engagement that should have been a controlled withdrawal and became a rout. Her story is not a moral lesson. It's a reminder that even when you do everything correctly, even when you assess the situation with clarity and choose the strongest available option, the outcome can still be catastrophic. And that's what makes it unbearable. Not the loss itself, but the knowledge that it could not have been easily prevented. That she was, in a very real sense, trapped by logic that turned out to be insufficient. That sometimes doing everything right is still not enough.